It is the resistance report for March 10th, 2017. Today I want to talk about jobs. Your job, my job, other people's job. Today was, after all, the report of the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the jobs created during the month of February, the first full month of the Trump administration. Now, one thing you ought to keep in mind is that Donald Trump, before he became president, when those job reports came out showing quite good numbers, unemployment down below 5%, 4.8%, 4.7%, over the past several years, that job report getting better and better, what did Donald Trump say? He said that the numbers were phony. He called the official unemployment rate one of the biggest hoaxes in American modern politics, and the biggest joke there is. And after the New Hampshire primary last year, Trump said, don't believe those phony numbers when you hear 4.9 and 5% unemployment. The number, said Donald Trump, is probably 28%, 29%. As high as 35%. In fact, he said, I have heard 42%. At a post-election rally in Iowa in December, he said, so many people can't get jobs. The unemployment number, as you know, is totally fiction. Well, today, the number came out, pretty good number, a continuation of the gradual jobs recovery we've seen over the last few years under Barack Obama. Not a dramatic departure, but Donald Trump turned around. The dramatic change was Donald Trump himself. He now embraces those job numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He says, in fact, he retweeted a Drudge Report headline, great again, plus 235,000. Well, today when a reporter asked Trump press secretary Sean Spicer what Trump thought about these new numbers and whether he stood by his remarks that the Bureau of Labor Statistics marks were phony, Spicer had a ready answer. He used the words that were the president's. Quote, they may have been phony in the past, but it is very real now, he said. Please. This is an administration that when it doesn't like the numbers, it attacks the numbers. It attacks the agency or the institution that is coming up with whatever facts it doesn't like. When it likes the numbers, when it likes the facts, it embraces them. They may have been phony in the past, but they're very real now. By the way, what may seem like a small matter is actually not a small matter. Spicer announced the job numbers, and he took to Twitter 22 minutes after the Bureau of Labor Statistics released the February jobs report. Now that breaks a rule by the Office of Management and Budget that has been in effect since the Nixon administration days, that says nobody in an administration, in an executive branch, can reveal those numbers for at least an hour after they come out publicly. Is Sean Spicer going to be held accountable for breaching that rule? The answer should be evident. Of course not. By the way, what about these numbers? Are we seeing a resurgence, a cause for celebration in the jobs numbers? Well, as I said a moment ago, they are simply a continuation of what we saw in terms of the jobs expansion under Obama. In fact, last February of 2016, the job number for February of 2016 was almost exactly the same as the job number for February of 2017. The job number of 2015 was almost exactly the same number as the number of jobs created in February of 2016 and now 2017. Donald Trump should get credit for absolutely nothing. In fact, his director of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, said as much this morning. He said, well, we've not really done anything. The policies that we put into place to try to get more jobs, they've not really gone into effect yet. Nonetheless, obviously, Donald Trump is taking as much credit as he possibly can. Now, one direct consequence of these steadily improving job numbers, at least steadily improving overall, is that Janet Yellen and the Federal Reserve Board are likely to raise interest rates fairly soon. You may remember that Donald Trump said that Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, she ought to be ashamed of herself, said Donald Trump, for keeping interest rates low during the Obama administration, thereby generating a lot of jobs. When you have low interest rates, that helps job growth. He said she ought to be ashamed of herself for playing politics. And you can expect that right now, Donald Trump, facing the prospect that Janet Yellen is going to raise interest rates because there is, in the Fed's view, some room for concern that the economy might overheat and generate some inflation, Donald Trump is going to be very angry with her. He's already signaled he doesn't want Yellen to raise interest rates, but as a matter of public policy and also as a matter of the way government has run for decades, the president has no say and should have no say over what the Federal Reserve does. I said a moment ago that those job numbers were pretty good. They are fairly good, but the big problem in the labor market is still twofold. One, the labor participation rate. That is the percentage of people who are of working age who are actually working. That labor participation rate is very low. It's still, as of today, 63%. That's almost a 30-year record low. What that means is that there are huge numbers of Americans, millions of Americans, who are too discouraged to even look for work. They are not counted as unemployed. That's why the unemployment rate looks so good. But they are too discouraged to look for work, and so they are out of the labor force. That is a huge problem. Many of them, most of them, are men. And what are they doing? It's not clear. Many of them are in rural areas of the country. Many of them have only a high school education. Many of them voted for Donald Trump. They are still doing badly. The other related problem has to do with wages. Now, the report today said that wages, average wages, are going up. Yes, but the median wage. Now, I want you to concentrate on the difference between the average wage and the median wage. The average reflects people at the top and people at the bottom. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'2". Do you get my point? People at the top bring up the average. That's why you want to look at the median. Half above, half below. The median tells you much more about where wages are, and median wages are still stuck in the mud by every indication and every indicator we have. The economy keeps growing, but where do most of the economic gains go? They're not going to the middle class. They're not going to the working class. They're not going to the poor. They're going to people at the top. That's what we've seen growing for the last 35 years. As the economy has grown, as wages have been flat for median workers, for the people right smack in the middle, most of the gains from the economy have gone to the top. And what do people at the top do with their money? Well, they don't spend all of it. It's impossible when you are earning millions and millions of dollars a year. It's almost impossible to spend it all. They put it into savings. Their savings go all around the world, wherever they can get the highest return. And what that means is that there is not enough demand in the system for employers to turn around and create a lot of new jobs. In other words, there are so many people unemployed today who are not even in the labor force because they're not good jobs for them to bring them into the labor force. They figure, why should I work for $8 or $9 an hour? The fundamental problem is we have lousy jobs, folks. And nothing Donald Trump has talked about or proposed is changing that. The only way you change that is if we invest Invest in the American workforce. Invest in people's education, in their job training, in free higher education, public higher education. Invest in health care. Invest in infrastructure that brings people together, makes it easier for people to get to work and communicate. But what is Donald Trump doing? He's going in the opposite direction. He's joining Republicans in actually making it harder and more costly for people to get health care. His budget is going to come out next week, and it will have major decreases in federal support for K through 12 education, for higher education, for everything else. And he's put off for a year his infrastructure plan. Remember that big $1 trillion infrastructure plan he campaigned on? Well, it's nowhere to be seen. Donald Trump and the Republicans believe in something called trickle-down economics. That means that if you make the rich richer and the corporations fatter and increase profits, that all trickles down somehow to average working people. My friends, it doesn't. It hasn't. We've had 35 years of so-called trickle-down economics, especially under Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, tax cuts for the people at the top, fatter corporate profits, and nothing has trickled down. Donald Trump is just a typical Republican. That is what he wants. He wants deregulation. He wants to get rid of regulations. Why? So corporations can do better, make fatter profits. He's talking about a big corporate tax cut. Why? So corporations can make bigger profits. It's good for the stock market. The stock market reflects anticipation of future corporate profits. Fine. But it's not good for most workers. The top 1% owns over 45% of all of the shares of stock. The top 10% owns 80% of all the shares of stock. The stock market goes up. That doesn't help average people. Now, there are probably no Trump voters who are watching me right now or listening to me right now. I hope, though, there are one or two of you, because you've got to know this. You've got to understand this. You've got to understand that you have actually bought into a lie and a giant bait-and-switch scheme. Donald Trump's administration is filled with more billionaires and more Wall Streeters than any administration in history, and you think they have your interests at heart? No. They believe in trickle-down economics, and that's what we are going to get. And now I have time, I hope you do, for some of your questions. Joe, it's Zucco. You ask, what are we missing because we're focused on Trump's tweets, Trump care, and Russia? Well, Joe, we're missing, number one, what's happening and beginning to happen in the federal departments and agencies. The deregulation, the tsunami of deregulation that is on its way, starting with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Labor Department and almost every other agency. Health regulations, safety regulations, environmental regulations, labor laws and regulations, and also regulations even to protect investors at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Consumer Finance Protection Regulations. All of those are in jeopardy, and all of them are on the way to being questioned. Donald Trump says 2 for 1, we're going to get rid of regulations. The other thing that you ought to beware of and keep your eyes on are the tax cuts that are coming down, not for average working people, but for the rich and for big corporations. That's what Republicans right now are working on when they're not working on their replacement for Obamacare. The other big priority for them is tax cuts for the rich and for big corporations. Finally, you ought to beware that with the huge increase in military expenditures that Trump wants, $45 billion, that's a 10% increase in the military budget. If he is not going to attack Social Security and Medicare, which he says he's not, then where does he get all of the money if he's also at the same time cutting taxes on the rich and big corporations? He's not. which means you ought to be ready and vigilant about major program cuts for the poor, in food stamps, in housing, in everything else that poor people need, including Medicaid. Michael Richter, am I pronouncing it correctly? Should Democrats be putting together legislation to amend parts of the Affordable Care Act that aren't working in order to provide an alternative to the bill, possible repeal by the Republicans? Michael, under ordinary circumstances, I would say yes, but under the kind of warfare circumstances we are now experiencing in Congress, I would fear that if the Democrats did make any effort to so-called repair, and it doesn't need major repair, there's small pieces of the Affordable Care Act that could actually be improved upon, but were the Democrats to open that door, Republicans would jump right through it. In other words, this is not the time. What we need to do is hold on to what we have, and I think there is a fairly good chance that because so many Republicans don't want any kind of a replacement for Obamacare, that we might actually keep the replacement, because other Republicans know that 20 million people without Obamacare, without the Affordable Care Act, would be a political catastrophe for the Republicans. So let's just hold tight. Eventually, we need, as I've made very, very clear, a single-payer system. Eventually, we will get that. Mark Dalpy, you ask, if Trump is in clear violation of the Emoluments Clause, how can Republicans get away with doing nothing about it? Well, several of you have asked about all of the ways in which Donald Trump is now impeachable, but why aren't Republicans doing anything about it? Simply because they don't want their president of their party to be impeached. Now, there may come a point with investigations and with more revelations of conflicts of interest and Russian connections and so forth, when the Republicans are going to be embarrassed by Trump. They're just going to start to worry that if they cling to him and stay loyal to him, they may actually suffer in the midterm elections of 2018. And that's when they may turn. That's when we might actually get some discussion, if not action, on impeachment. Jen Ward, you ask, is there any centralized entity overseeing all of the Trump-Russia investigations? Jen, there isn't. And what worries me even more is that none of the investigations right now are bipartisan. You've got an FBI investigation, but that is under James Comey, who is under, ultimately, Sessions, Jeff Sessions. Even though Sessions has recused himself, he's still there as Attorney General, and Sessions is under Trump. How can you expect Comey to investigate the people who are in line over his head in terms of the command of authority from the president on down? You can't. And when it comes to the Senate Intelligence Committee also conducting an investigation, that is run mostly by Republicans. The chair is a Republican. We cannot trust that committee to do an impartial investigation, which gets me to my point that I keep hammering on. We need a special prosecutor, an independent counsel who is going to do this. Now, what's the difference between a special prosecutor or an independent special prosecutor and a select committee or a commission? The difference is this. A commission or even a bipartisan select committee would look at the entire quagmire of Russia. That might be important, like the 9/11 Commission. That would be good. We need to do that eventually. But I worry that there's so many pieces to the puzzle that might avoid the key issue, which is what did Donald Trump know, and when did he know it, and did he know about what the Russians were doing to try to give him the election of 2016. If he knew, or if he should have known, based on the evidence any reasonable person would have in his position, if he knew and did nothing about it, that is potentially not only impeachable, but that is potentially a treasonous offense. That's what we ought to be investigating. A special prosecutor, special counsel goes after criminal offenses. That's what we need to investigate. Will the Republicans take away coverage of those of us with pre-existing conditions? Elaine, the bill that you might call it Obamacare light, it is so Obamacare light that although technically it requires insurers to cover people with pre-existing conditions, it doesn't require them to make insurance affordable to people with pre-existing conditions. So in other words, if you have had an illness or some major problem that suggests to an insurer that you are a high risk, that insurer can charge you anything, including a high copayment and a gigantic deductible, to the point where you can't possibly afford it. That is the equivalent of not getting it. Samuel Lester, will Trump's new executive order banning travel to the United States from 6 Muslim countries get by the courts? Well, Samuel, we're going to find out pretty soon, because there is litigation on that right now. Jim Hunter, who's actually running the White House? Jim, my view is that you've got Reince Priebus, who is trying to keep this White House under control and minimize the fallout from Trump's tweets. That's basically what he's doing, and try to avoid or minimize the leaks that are still endemic. And then you have Vice President Pence, Michael Pence, who's actually working with Paul Ryan and with Mitch McConnell on the legislative agenda. And that is the most important part of the White House. I think Pence is in a key position. And then you've got agency heads, department heads, who are just now coming into their departments, finding out where the men's room and women's rooms actually are. They're not doing anything yet. Once they start, once Scott Pruitt and others begin actually working, they can do a lot of damage, and the White House may not be able to oversee everything they're doing. I don't believe that the White House will. I don't think Donald Trump cares what Betsy DeVos does specifically with regard to federal funding of religious schools. No, that's something that Michael Pence and Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell will be dealing with if it comes up for legislation. Sander Clanburn, what's happening, or what's happened to Sessions and his lies? Any chance he'll have to step down? Sander, I believe, and the record shows very clearly, that Jeff Sessions lied under oath. That should be enough to force his resignation. He also says he is recused and is recusing himself from overseeing the FBI, but if he lied under oath, what sureness do we have, what assurance that he isn't going to lie about being recused or recusing himself? So he ought to be out of there. Now, it's easy to say, but how do you get him out of there? Republicans, remember, have a majority in both the House and the Senate. They have a majority on the Judiciary Committee that, under law, ought to be pursuing Sessions or anybody who lies under oath. The Justice Department ought to be pursuing anybody who lies under oath, but Jeff Sessions is the Attorney General of the Justice Department. Do you get my drift? The only way Jeff Sessions is held accountable is if the Democrats get into the majority in at least one House. And that happens, hopefully, in 2018, and a lot of that depends on you. It depends on you being mobilized and energized and organized to make that happen. Sheila Bernstein, what happened to Trump's tweets? I didn't come across them this week. Well, Sheila, Trump has been tweeting away. In fact, somewhere around here, I did jot down some of this week's doozies. Just for example, on Monday, he tweeted, "Thank you to ExxonMobil for a $20 billion investment that's creating more than 45,000 manufacturing and construction jobs in the USA. He tweeted a total of 5 times about Exxon this week, and he shared a video in which he thanked the company. This is absolute rubbish. Rubbish. Plans for ExxonMobil's investment actually began in 2013. Trump had nothing to do with them. On Tuesday, Trump claimed via Twitter that former President Obama released 122 prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, who have returned, said Trump, to the battlefield. Rubbish. Now, there is some news coverage suggesting that 122 former Gitmo prisoners have been re-engaged in some terrorist activity in the Middle East, but only 9 of that 122, those 122, were released by Obama. Do you understand? Distortion. Distortion after distortion. One more I have to give you. Tuesday, March 7th, Trump tweeted that Obamacare, quote, is a complete and total disaster. It's imploding fast. And then he followed up 1 hour later, promising to remove state lines in healthcare rollouts. That is, state insurance that is only now allowed to sell within a state. Well, that whole business is a complete fabrication. First of all, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is not in meltdown. Small reforms can save it. One of the big problems with it is that, as I've already suggested to you, big insurance companies are merging like mad, and they have a lot of market power, and they are dropping out of the exchanges because they want more money. And as far as selling insurance across state lines, which I think would be a good idea, there is nothing in the Republicans' new substitute that provides for that. Nothing. Nada. Okay, one more. Anita Ashland, what book recommendations do you have to help give us some perspective on these perplexing times, in addition to your Saving Capitalism book, which I'm reading and enjoying? Thank you, Anita. I do have books that I think you ought to be taking a look at. I've already recommended to you Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can't Happen Here. Sinclair Lewis writing in the 1930s about tyranny, about fascism coming to America. There's another book that some of you might find very, very useful. This is a book written a number of years ago by Barrington Moore, Jr., a political scientist, an extraordinarily deft theoretician and very thoughtful scholar and historian, called The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. It's a heavy read, but put it on your list. I want to just recommend one more to you. And this is a book I've just read by Luke Mayville. It's a new book. It's called John Adams and the Fear of American Oligarchy. Just came out from Princeton University Press. It talks about what John Adams, the second president of the United States, what he thought about the dangers of America turning into an oligarchy. Fascinating, important read. You need to be well informed. You need to keep track of the facts. You need to keep track of the truth. You need to be organized and mobilized. You need to be part of the resistance. If you're not part of the resistance, you are collaborating indirectly with Trump. I want you to have a good weekend. Get some sleep, relax, have some fun, and be prepared to get back into the resistance next Monday, or maybe take part of the weekend and be in the resistance as well. And I'll see you Monday.